Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. My guest today is philosopher Peter Klein. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So let me just give a quick introduction to who you are before we get started on the conversation. So you have worked primarily in epistemology, and you are particularly known for defending infinitism, which is a particular solution to the regress problem of knowledge, which we'll get into. And you're also known for defending a defeasibility account of knowledge, which we'll get to as well. You were, until recently, a professor at Rutgers University.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see, you've written one book, Certainty, A Refutation of Skepticism.
That's right.
And then more recently, you co-edited a couple of books, right? Ad Infinitum, New Essays on Epistemological Infinitism, and Explaining Knowledge, New Essays on the Gettier Problem. Okay, so I want to talk about infinitism first. That was actually the way I first heard about you. I think the first person I ever interviewed on this podcast, we talked about epistemology and we talked about the regress problem, and we were going over the options. And he said something like, "Well, and then there is infinitism, but almost nobody believes that. I think there's this one guy, Peter Klein, who defends it up at Rutgers," and so that's how I came to know about you. So let's get started from the beginning. So what is...
Somebody one time said, I think it may have been Fumerton, I'm not sure, that the infinitist position is, and then he outlined something, and he said, and by the way, the is a definite description.
Okay, so let's talk about the regress problem, right? So that's because that's obviously how this comes up. What is this regress problem about knowledge?
Well, the regress problem is a really old problem. Aristotle was certainly aware of it in the posterior analytics. Plato was aware of it. But I think many people, when they think of the regress problem, will go back to Sextus Empiricus's Outlines of Pyrrhonism. The argument goes, or the problem goes something like this. And we have to keep in mind that Sextus is reporting what the Pyrrhonians say about the regress. So they may have a slant on it that not everybody's going to buy. But the regress goes something like this. Let's suppose that there is some proposition, or belief, better. By belief, I mean belief state, and you're believing something. The question is, do you have a reason for believing it? Let's suppose the answer to that is yes, you do have a reason. Well, obviously, what might happen is that the person with whom you're discussing may say, well, what's your reason for the reason? And what's your reason for the reason for the reason for the reason, etc. And the dogmatist, and I'll explain what I think Sextus and the Pyrrhonians mean by dogmatists. The dogmatists think that we can come to settled knowledge, beliefs which need no further reasoning. We can decide, take any proposition. In the end, there will be some that are just undecidable, but there will be many that are decidable. So take a proposition P that's decidable. What that means is that at some point, we're going to be able to say the dogmatist is right, P is correct. Or if what the Pyrrhonians referred to as the academic skeptics, meaning the people who were running Plato's academy at the time, the academic skeptics would say, no, we can show you that you can't know. Take something you think is decidable, we'll show you it's not decidable. To what are sometimes called the dogmatists. Well, in any case, there seem to be three possible structures, or at least the Pyrrhonians thought there were three possible structures for the reasoning that could settle matters. One, it would end with some proposition that itself didn't need a reason. It was asserted no further reason was needed. That's what they called the mode of hypothesis, laying down something, hypothesis. The second one that one could imagine is a kind of what they called circular reasoning. We might call it begging the question, but that word has unfortunately come to mean something else. It means to raise a question. But let's just talk about circular reasoning. So that's a second structure. Third structure is the reasoning just goes on forever. There is no stopping point of the reasoning. Now, they may be wrong that those are the only three possible structures. There may be other structures. Some of them are easy to think of. You could have a foundationalist structure where the number of propositions that are justified from that foundational one it is, in fact, infinite, and you're at one of those points. So there may be an infinite number of propositions between you and the foundationalist one. You could think of a circular pattern, an infinitely circular pattern. You could also think that there are circular patterns along the way toward some sort of foundational belief.
Do you know of any structures that would be a solution to the regress problem that isn't a combination of those three?
Well, I think contemporary coherentism may not be a combination of those three. At least they would, I think so, because they may think that what justifies a proposition is that it's a member of a set of propositions that's coherent. So coherence, they wouldn't sanction circular reasoning, but they may see a proposition being justified as emerging because of the coherent structure. So I think they at least would hold that their particular view, and Thoreau's explicitly says this in places, their view is not a view defending circular reasoning. They're at least the contemporary coherentists. So I think there is that fourth structure that seems on the surface of it quite plausible. I would say, if this is the time to say it, that if you go back to Ernie Sosa's The Raft and Pyramid, he makes a pretty good case that coherentism is a form of foundationalism. Because what justifies any proposition in the set of coherent propositions is that it is a member of that set. So you could think of the whole set as, in a sense, self-foundational. Each one of them is justified because it's a member of this set. Whether that's the most fruitful way of looking at coherentism, that's another question.
So let me step back, because now you're kind of getting into what I wanted to ask you next, which is to sort of go through a bit of, because I think intuitively, right, there seems to be a bit of more of an appeal to foundationalism and coherentism.
Absolutely.
So since we're already talking about coherentism...
A lot more than a bit, right? Okay.
So since we're already talking about coherentism, let's stay on that for just a moment. So you mentioned there's the standard kind is this sort of circular reasoning, right, where X justifies Y and Y justifies X, and so it's quite literally begging the question.
They wouldn't be quite that transparent, but that's
right. Okay.
They'd make a bigger circle, but
yeah, okay.
Transitivity holds, and so yeah,
right.
Okay.
So that seems like, fairly clearly begging the question. Now you're talking about this other variant this sort of emergent variant, which is rather than being like a circle, it seems more like a web.
Like a web.
Right. And the very fact that all of these beliefs are cohering in this web is taken to be justification for each of them.
That's correct.
Now,
there may be other conditions required for justification, for example, empirical adequacy or something like that. But you're right. That's what they would say.
Now, it seems like, and I'm not sure if this is where you were going with it, but it seems to me the first thing I think of is that it seems very possible to have a web of beliefs, all of which are false, and yet which are all coherent with each other.
Correct.
Similarly, it seems possible to have a web of beliefs, most of which are true, some of which are false, and yet all of which cohere with each other.
Correct. I think all that's right. And I think with the Pyrrhonians, and I'll take their part for a little while at least, what the Pyrrhonians would say is, suppose you have a coherentist, the contemporary kind, the DeRose kind, the Stuart Cohn kind. You'd have that kind of coherentist in front of you. And the question to ask them is, okay, the reason you're giving me for accepting that full set of propositions, or included in the reasons that you'll give me for those, there may be other reasons, but included in those reasons would be something like, well, they're coherent. That's what justifies me, or partially, or adds some justification to my believing each one of them. And the question to them would be, okay, that's interesting. Do you think coherence is truth conducive? Now, if they say no, I think the Pyrrhonian would say, strike three. I mean, you don't even need a strike one or two. That's it, strike three. If they would say, well, I don't know whether it's truth conducive or not, same thing. You're accepting this whole, each one of the members here, because it's part of a coherent set, but you don't think that coherence is truth conducive. Why not accept this other criterion for accepting a proposition? Well, the only answer I think they can give is yes, coherence is truth conducive. And then the question's going to be, why do you think that's true? So they can't get out. It may be that I don't think an infinitist is going to deny, or has to deny, the web kind of structure to our beliefs there. There are mutual supporting. If you think of propositions, again, I don't remember exactly whose analogy this is. It might even be mine. If you think of the poles in a teepee, well, the one pole is supporting this pole is supporting this one is supporting this one. They're mutually supportive. And it's that kind of picture that the coherentist has. But of course, the question's going to be to them in that picture, well, what are they resting on? And you could say it's teepees all the way down, like people said it was turtles all the way down. That hardly seems to be an answer from the Pyrrhonian point of view. So if the Pyrrhonian assumes that as epistemic agents, we want, if there are contrary propositions, we want a better reason for believing one rather than the other. And it looks like the coherentist would be surrendering that objective if they were to say, well, I don't know if coherence is truth conducive, or no, it's not truth conducive. So I think the Pyrrhonian would use these modes to show that the coherentist is going to have to go beyond claiming that justification arises simply on the basis of coherence. As they'll say, they could grant it and then say, is it truth conducive?
And so what it seems like you're getting at is that eventually the coherentist is going to have to accept something like the idea that coherence justifies is something like a foundational belief. And so now they're at foundationalism.
That's correct. That's correct. I want to go back to the Pyrrhonians for one second. Remember, there were 5 modes in Agrippa's chapter. Mm-hmm. 3 of them dealt with the structure of reasoning. So they thought of the 3 that we've talked about. There were 2 other modes that they mentioned that summarize some other modes that they mentioned earlier. In the earlier chapters, there are the 10 modes of Nicodemus. Well, all right. What they do is they say that one of the other modes, besides ad infinitum, circularity, and foundationalism, they didn't use that word, but we can use that word. One was the mode of discrepancy, and the other was the mode of relativity. And what did they mean? Well, they meant that there are 2 sources, typically, of our knowledge: experience and reasoning. And experience is based on, they were talking about sense experience. And they would say, look, the sense experience that you have is relative to the person, either because of the person's age, health, previous perceptions, etc. So you can't allow perception to settle matters. For a long time, people believed the stars were moving and the sun was moving and the moon was moving because that's the way it looked. Well, there's another explanation, but what the Pyrrhonians would be, they weren't arguing this. I'm doing it. They would just say appearances can be deceiving, and if they can be deceiving, then you shouldn't trust them at the basis. The other mode, the mode of discrepancy, is the mode of appealing to others or experts or common opinion to settle matters. So what they start with is the view that there are these 5 modes. Modes are ways that the Pyrrhonian had of confronting the dogmatist and of maintaining their Pyrrhonism. They were like practices. Here's how when you learn to play the piano, you practice stuff. If you learn to be a skeptic, you practice the modes. That's the analogy. And the target here were the dogmatists. Prime example is Aristotle, named on the first page of the outlines of empiricism. And what they call the academics, those were people who would say, no, we can show you do not have knowledge. Pyrrhonian doesn't assert you don't have knowledge. What the Pyrrhonian says is we live by appearances alone. And they would say, let me take a step back. When you look at the 3 modes of reasoning, in the chapter on the 5 modes, Sextus does not give any argument. What he says is the mode of ad infinitum has no starting point. Now, he must mean by that starting point what I would call an ending point and what the foundationalists would call an ending point. There's no foundation. Well, that's right. That's true. That's exactly what the infinitist says. The infinitists wouldn't find that to be a problem. That's their view. So that's not an objection. The question is, why is the infinite regress rejected by the Pyrrhonians? That's the question. And I think the answer is that Aristotle argued that if reasoning takes time, So if it takes time to give a reason, each one, now there are these super tasking solutions to this problem, but let's assume that the reasoning gets harder and harder and harder the longer the chain is. It doesn't get shorter and shorter and shorter. So it gets harder and more difficult, and you have to think a lot more. But you don't have to assume it's a lot more. You can just assume it's a finite fixed amount of time. You can't traverse an infinite series in a finite amount of time. That's Aristotle's motto. He uses it over and over again. Sextus mentions that at one point. He says you can't judge an infinite series. And I think what he means by that is just what Aristotle meant. You can't finish it. And so there's no finishing point, even though he uses the expression starting point. And that's the problem that infinitists face.
Right. So, and infinitists can't, or at least you don't, say something like, I actually have an infinite number of reasons in my mind. I have thought of them, and that's how I attain knowledge, right? That would actually be absurd.
I don't know if it'd be absurd, but it's certainly false.
Okay, before diving more into infinitism, I do want to cover foundationalism a little bit more. So since it is definitely the most popular view.
Yeah, it's dominated epistemology since Plato.
So, I guess we've established more or less what the view is. What is in your view the biggest problem with it?
So I'm not quite sure we've established all the essential elements of it. Let me just mention the two so that we're both on the same page. One is that there are some propositions that don't require justification by some other proposition in order to rise to the level of justification. They are justified. They don't think they're unjustified, but they're not justified in terms of something else, meaning another proposition. They may be justified by the way in which they arose. They may be justified by your being an epistemic authority and you assert X. But let's start. Here's something justified, and all the other propositions in the building, in the higher structure, but I think I like to think of it in terms of a chain of reasons, depend for their justification ultimately upon the initial proposition. As Aristotle would say, the further back you get in the reasoning, the more certain, and they're epistemically certain and they're epistemically prior. So there's a structure here. It's not a haphazard one. That's the picture I think that foundationalists want to paint. I think there are two things wrong with it. First, there are no foundational propositions, and second, justification doesn't get transmitted from one proposition to another. So I think both of those claims are false, and let's start with the one that I think is the easiest. They think, the foundationalists think, there are these privileged propositions. But let's suppose you're a self-conscious foundationalist, you're an epistemologist, and you're a foundationalist, and you assert, here's the foundational proposition. And I say back, I'll be the Pyrrhonian for a moment, I'll say back, what makes it a foundational proposition? What properties does this foundational proposition have that the others didn't have? There must be something that distinguishes it. What is it? Call it property F for foundationalism. And I say, okay, let me ask you two questions. One, are you good at recognizing F properties when a belief or a proposition has that property? Second, is that property truth conducive? Well, if they say no to either one of those, they're just in the same trouble that we talked about when we talked about the coherentists. Once they recognize the question, I think they have to give an answer unless they're going to give up epistemic agency. And I take epistemic agents to be people who are not just after the truth, they're after knowledge. That's what an epistemic agent is. Of course, knowledge entails truth, so they're after truth too. But what they want is knowledge. That's what an epistemic agent is after. And I think the epistemic agent has surrendered that goal. If the epistemic agent were to say at that point, well, I don't know if F is truth conducive, and I don't know if I'm any good at recognizing it, I think they have to believe both of those things. Now, does that mean that that question always arises? No. If you and I are talking, or if I'm inquiring, I'm entitled to take some things for granted for the time being. But for the time being isn't the kind of thing that the foundationalist needs. Foundationalist needs something that is justified, but not in virtue of some other reason. Well, once you ask, are you good at recognizing those kinds of things? And are things with that, what makes that, the possession of that property, truth conducive? Is there anything that makes it no? If you say no, you're giving up. That's the first place where we differ with the foundationalists, and a reason for doing it. I could go into the second one about justification transmission, if you wish. Up to you.
Now, I want to make sure that that first one is understood. So the problem seems to be that essentially once you get to the foundational property, right, you essentially can always ask why. Like, why is that the foundational property? Or how do you know that that's the foundational property? Something like that. And
No, not quite. Not why is that why is that, let's grant, okay, that's the property that this thing has. Are you good at recognizing it? And second, is it truth conducive?
Is it truth conducive? Okay.
So there may be other ways that to attack foundationalism, but the two that I favor are those.
Mm-hmm. And if the person says yes, I am good at recognizing it, and yes, it is truth conducive, then you can
know what's coming.
Right. Then you can ask, do you have a reason for that? And
yeah, what makes it truth conducive? You say it's truth conducive. What about it makes it truth conducive? And if you were to say something like, well, it's self-evident, I'd say, okay, are self-evident propositions likely to be true? Whatever self-evidence is, because foundationalists could give different. Somebody could say it's clear and distinct. That's the basis. Somebody else could say, look, it just strikes me so hard when I think that my intuitive juices all flow towards that thing. And I'd say, okay, good. I get why you're picking that one out. The other things in the chain don't have that kind of oomph behind them. They aren't clear and distinct or whatever. Now, does that fact lead to the proposition being true? I think Descartes saw that problem. He offered clarity and distinction as the criterion for truth. But then he recognized, well, wait a minute. Why is it that clear and distinct propositions are true? And then here comes out God. Here's God, the proof for God's existence and epistemic benevolence and all the rest. And maybe that argument works, maybe it doesn't. Sort of doubt it. But the point is that whatever criterion you use for picking out the foundational ones, one can ask, is that thing truth conducive? And are you good at recognizing that property? That was the point.
Yeah. And that's and either the foundationalists will give an answer, a reason that is new and sort of pushed back now, and Correct. You can continue doing that. Or I suppose if it was really a foundational, the the foundationalist would be stuck almost as if repeating the same repeating the same foundational back to you without really answering the question.
Or they could just get tired of the discussion and walk away.
Right.
I have to go eat now.
Yeah.
Or whatever. So they could give up, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, we're more than epistemic agents, and eating's a good thing. But you're surrendering your epistemic agency at that point. And what we're engaged in epistemology is, okay, let's be epistemic agents and figure out what knowledge is. And we'll leave the eating for tomorrow or the next hour.
Okay, so let's move on to infinitism. So when you were going over infinitism, we sort of left that it's not that you literally have an infinite number of propositions in your mind that you're thinking of as justifying. So what is it? What can you kind of just characterize a bit more the infinitist position as you hold it?
Good. I'll try to do this in a finite amount of time. Okay, let's go back to that second feature of foundationalism that I mentioned. That justification arises, if you like, in the foundational propositions and is transferred by reasoning to the non-foundational ones, the ones that get further and further away from the foundation. One of the problems with that view is that unless you have a whole bunch of entailments in there, the longer the chain, the less justified the one at the end, the one furthest from the foundational proposition, the less justified it becomes.
So your credence is going to kind of trickle out little by little as you go through one to the next.
Yeah, you bet. Now, if there are entailments in there, you could up the credence, right? You get a little bump. If P entails Q, then unless Q entails P, Q is going to be more likely than P. So if there are entailments in there, you'll get a bump. But there's always that danger that the further you get, the less credible the proposition is. That, I take it, is contrary to the intuition we have that the longer the chain, the more, this is a coherentist intuition, the better embedded your proposition is in a longer chain, the better justified it is. This person is better justified than that one because this person has actually traced these things back. That's a problem that I see with the basic foundationalist picture. There's another problem. This is a harder one to explain in a way, I think. But I take justification or justifying to be like any other verb that ends in fy, except for a couple that don't have the same root. And the root is in Latin for ficare, to mean to make. When you certify something, it gets certified. When you magnify something, it gets magnified. When you rigidify something, you made it rigid. When you, pick any one you want. When you dignify something, you make it dignified. That's what the FY does. I think justifying a belief is what you do. You justify the belief. The belief doesn't get justified by these propositions. You employ other propositions. You employ your reasoning to make this thing justified. That's what you do. You make it justified. Now, is that proposition that you used to justify this one, is it itself justified? The foundationalist says, of course it is. In fact, it's got to be at least as justified, if not more justified, than the premise in an argument. It has to be at least as justified or more justified. Well, at least has got that in there. So I, on the other hand, think, no, you may not have justified this one yet. Justifying is something we do. So justification, as I embed the proposition in a chain of reasons that I give, I make it more and more justified. Now, one more little crucial point about this is that you've done, when you find the first reason in this chain as you're going backwards to justify this one, you've justified it a lot. Then when you find the next one, you've added a little bit of justification to the one at the end, but not as much as this one did. So, as I see it, the amount that contributes to the justification of the final one, that was the one you started doing the same thing the Pyrrhonians, the ones you started with, the contribution gets lower and lower and lower. I'm not a formal epistemologist. I don't know how to work that out in Bayesian terms. There have, thank heavens, there is a book, and some people who are good at that stuff. And I'm going to mispronounce her name, I know, but it's Jean Penengerberg and David Atkinson have published a book called Fading Foundations, in which that's the very point of their book, that infinitism can account for why at some point giving reasons becomes less and less important, because it's adding less and less to the one you started with. Mm-hmm. Now, does that mean you can ever say, well, there is no more? Well, the infinitist says, of course there is. Take any proposition you think is foundational and then run that argument. That's essentially what infinitism argues. If I could say one more word about the Pyrrhonians.
Yes.
I think the Pyrrhonians were infinitists. When they distinguished their view at the very beginning from the dogmatists and the what they called the academics. We call it academic skepticism because we've adopted their terminology. But when they describe their own view, they say one of the solutions to this conundrum about whether you accept a proposition finally or not is to continue to inquire. That's what skepticism, the root of the word, means, to inquire. So they can accept the results of reasoning, but they would not believe it, if you like, in the way the dogmatist does. The dogmatist thinks the matter is settled, and up comes the Kripke puzzle of belief and all the rest, and the dogmatism. So that when they argue against infinitism, they're arguing against it as a solution to the dogmatic, for the dogmatists. The dogmatists can't appeal to that because you have to come, according to the dogmatists, you have a foundational proposition, and you have to, if you keep challenging that foundational proposition, there'll be no, quote, starting point. There won't be a foundation. Well, of course there won't be a foundation. That's what the infinitists are arguing. There is no foundation. Infinitism, if it's a view that says that we're going to be able to settle matters by posing this solution, a dogmatic solution, the Pyrrhonians are correct. It won't work for the dogmatist. It can work for the skeptic, for the Pyrrhonian kind of skeptic, if they want to keep inquiring.
Right. So it sounds like we've covered foundationalism and coherentism. Of course, another solution is the academic solution, which is to say something actually like we know we can assent to the fact that you can't know anything, and presumably other than this, right? And that's, of course, a bit of a problem. Now, it sounds like your infinitism is saying we don't have this kind of settled knowledge. Rather, infinitism is a way for you to make sense of still having beliefs, still inquiring, still seeking justifications, despite the fact that there is actually no settled, dogmatic, as you call it, knowledge. Would you say that that's fair?
Yes, I think that is fair. And it's also, if I, knowing that we were going to do this, I went back and looked at a passage in the Pyrrhonians, and if I could read that, it won't take long, I promise.
Sure.
But let me see if I can find it. I will find it. Yes. Okay. Let me turn this light on. Is the picture still okay?
It's fine.
Okay. Now remember, by academics, they mean academic skeptics. Mm-hmm. People who argue, just as you said, we can show you that you don't have knowledge. And they themselves, the Pyrrhonians, when they refer to themselves as skeptics. They think they're the genuine skeptics, and the Platonic skeptics, the ones that have taken over the academy, are just dogmatists, because they think reason is settled, you don't have knowledge. Mm-hmm. Okay. And although both the academics and the skeptics say they believe some things, so the skeptics say they believe things, the Pyrrhonians, yet here too the differences between the two philosophies is quite plain. For the word believe has different meanings. It means not to resist, but simply to follow without any strong impulse or inclination, as the boy is said to believe his tutor. But sometimes it means to assent to a thing of deliberate choice. And the translation uses assent to a thing with deliberate choice and with a kind of sympathy due to strong desire, as when the incontinent man believes him who approves of his extravagant mode of life. Since, therefore, Carneades and Clytomachus, they were the academics, Carneades and Clytomachus declare that a strong inclination accompanies their credence and credibility of the object, namely they don't know, while we say our belief is a matter of simple yielding without any consent. Here too there must be differences between us and them. They didn't want to be confused with the people who were saying you don't have knowledge and giving arguments. And what they did is essentially what you just said. They'll distinguish between assent, which is this strong kind of belief. It's a deliberate choice. It closes further inquiry. Whereas the yielding kind, when one of the accusations leveled against the Pyrrhonians was, if a carriage is coming towards you, a horse carriage is coming toward you, you're going to say, they think the Pyrrhonian is going to say, well, what is that? Maybe it's a carriage, maybe it isn't a carriage, and they're going to get run over. Or the caricature of the Pyrrhonian that the Stoics would put forth was they're walking in a road, there's a huge hole, and they just fall in it because they don't assent to the fact that there's a hole there. Mm-hmm. But what they say is the skeptical response to hunger is to eat. This, and they didn't say this, but I'll put words in their mouth. The skeptical response towards horses running towards you is to get out of the way. They're not impractical. They just don't think that issues are settled once and for all. That's just the difference. And the infinitist, I think, can adopt a Pyrrhonian stance.
Do you think that when you talk about dogmatism in this context, and when we talk about foundationalists and coherentists trying to find settled knowledge in response to the regress. By dogmatist knowledge or assent, these various terms we've been using, do you mean something like certainty?
Yes.
Something like 100% credence?
I mean something like psychological certainty. Mm-hmm. So that what happens is that if you believe you know, then you're going to believe that all information that counts against you or counts against your belief has got to be wrong, or there's something wrong with it. So I think I think there is a kind of objective certainty available to us that is compatible with rejecting psychological certainty, the kind that determine. And when we get to the Gettier problem, I can explain that.
Okay.
But let's just keep those two notions of certainty, that what we seek as epistemic agents is certainty. It's a kind of knowledge that's objectively certain. And I think we can get it. But it does not bring with it the psychological certainty.
Interesting. Okay. Let's. I'll definitely remember to bring that up when we talk about Gettier, because that's interesting. I have one more. Really, I think only one more question to ask you about infinitism, and it is what occurs to me as the most immediate problem after you've sort of spelled it out the way that you've spelled it out, and it is this. So I've got some proposition, and I want to justify it, and it's totally okay if there's no ultimate foundation. However, I'm going to justify it with some immediate next reason,
right?
And I don't have a justification for that one yet.
You may or you may not. You may have justified it. Let's suppose you don't.
Right. I'm sort of positing, like, I'm at a point right now where I'm justifying proposition P with reason R, and I'm just sort of positing I'm at a point where R is not yet justified.
Right.
What gives me the right to use R if I haven't justified it yet?
Nothing yet. Why did you use R? Well, you used R to justify the thing R was a reason. That R was being proffered as a reason. Now, are you justified in using R yet? No, you aren't. So what should you do? Well, sometimes you give up being an epistemic agent and go eat. But other times you will say, okay, here's a problem. If I want to continue doing my epistemic agency thing, I'll find a reason for it. And several objections might occur to people. Well, what if you don't have a reason? What if you look around and you don't have one? Remember what my view of reasoning is. By justifying this one, and you move back a little bit, you've done a lot of work. You've justified this one. Now when you come back to this one, the R, where you don't have a justification yet, does that rob the one you started with, needed a reason? Does that rob all the justification? No, it doesn't. But does it, because you did a lot of work? It's like putting money in the bank. On the other hand, you shouldn't think that this matter is settled. Mm-hmm. You got back to this. The second problem would be, well, that sounds like you have to have a storehouse that has an infinite number of members of reasons that don't repeat. That's the other part of infinitism, right? But you can't use in this chain a reason that's appeared earlier. That's
right. That's why we rejected the circular reasoning option.
Exactly. Right. So it has to be a new one. And the argument's going to be, wait a minute, at this moment, do I have all that stuff available? Is this whole chain available? And the answer is no. You don't have it now. But availability, when So, in giving reasons for believing various things, you may get back to something where you can't now foresee what the reason is, because you might not even be able to comprehend the question. The problem is the answer, I think, is as you move back, your concepts, your ability to reason gets better. And so if something isn't available to you now, it doesn't mean it won't be available along the line.
Yeah, that seems actually to me like a pretty good model of historical intellectual progress, right?
That seems right.
We keep asking new questions. Those new questions take us to new places that bring up new questions that we couldn't have even imagined before. And now we have the ability to conjure up all kinds of reasons that we couldn't have even imagined before.
Exactly. Good. So availability is available at time, at some time, or at some point in the chain. It may not be temporal, but some point in the chain.
Now, I think what's troubling me though is when I'm in one part of this chain, again, that moment when I'm trying to justify a proposition with a reason that hasn't yet been justified, right? My question is more like, so again, calling the proposition I'm trying to justify P, and the reason I'm justifying it with R, and R has not been justified yet. My question is more like, how do I get to believe R in the first place if it has no justification yet? It's almost like, how do I grab onto R at all?
I think when you ask yourself, what justifies this belief, things will pop into your head. I don't think you have to appeal to some belief. So, all right, this may be the way to transition to the Gettier problem, but a foundationalist will typically say, believing the proposition that has the reason as the content is a cause of believing this other proposition. They're, in general, not always, but in general, foundationalists are reliabilists. They think, and reliabilists look at the etiology of a belief. How did you get this belief? Well, it was formed by employing this belief was formed by employing this one. I mean, when you think of process reliabilism, some beliefs aren't formed by employing some a reason. It could just be for a process reliabilist. If it's a foundational proposition, it could occur to you because of your sense experience or whatever. Now, you can imagine what an infinitist is going to do with that. But the question, how does a belief arise, is that what the reliabilist will say, if this is a result of, if this proposition, belief, sorry, the belief state with the proposition as its content, if this belief arose as a result of reasoning, then the thing that functioned as the reason had to have already been there because it caused this one. I'm not saying that for a minute. And when we get to the Gettier problem, I think there's a real problem with this etiology of belief way of solving the Gettier problem. But you ask, how does the belief arise? Maybe you dreamt it up in your sleep. Maybe a falling leaf reminded you, this didn't happen. I mean, an apple. You thought, my God, why is that thing falling towards the center of the earth? And is the moon falling constantly towards the center of the earth? Oh, wow, maybe there's some universal force. I'm not saying that's what Newton did. But I don't know how beliefs, I don't think anybody else does either yet. But how does that belief arise? Sometimes because you're looking for an answer. sometimes it seems, I'll report it, my own psychology here, see if it matches yours. Very often, if I want to see whether something is true, I, if you like, invent a belief, which, were it true, would function as a reason. And one of the reasons I might come to believe the thing is because it solves the problem here, at least temporarily. Now, you have to be careful, because that sounds an awful lot like rationalizing. Sounds like, well, I believe this thing because it answers the question that can't be why. But what you can always do is then ask about this one. Well, what's is that a good enough reason for believing this one? Transcendental arguments are like that. Why do I believe this? Because this explains it. So I have some facts. Why do I believe this thing is true? Because if that thing were true, it'd explain all this stuff. I don't see, in the end, could the infinite chain of reasoning lead you to make systematic mistakes? Yes, could. I don't think it does, and I could give you some reasons why I don't think it does. But an infinitist doesn't think that we have these reasons that serve as foundational, the propositions embedded in the reason serve as foundational propositions. That's more of a problem for a foundationalist, because it seems very hard to me to get from those foundational propositions to these others. When you try to do it, good. How do you get from sense data propositions to claims about material objects? I mean, G.E. Moore had trouble with that one. And I have trouble with it. I believe there are sense data propositions, but I don't think they're foundational in the way that the foundationalist thinks. I don't know if that answered the question.
No, I think it did. I mean, what I'm taking from it is, if you are looking to justify some proposition, then some possible reasons will pop up, and that's just an empirical question of how that happens, or a methodological question. You may pull one out of a hat.
Yeah.
Right.
But
so
not always,
and not
sometimes
always.
You're stumped, and you have to say, okay, I'm going to put this on hold. I'm going to go back. I'll go read something. I'll go read the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and maybe it'll help me. Who knows?
Right.
You don't. The point is, you don't need that reason, the reason for the reason, in order for this reason to justify the next one down the line.
Right.
Yeah.
And then it's just a matter of, do you want to continue right now the chain?
Correct.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's very pressing, and sometimes you can get hungry.
Right. Or you can need to move out of the way of the carriage.
Exactly.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Next week, Peter Klein explains his account of knowledge by going over the famous Gettier problem. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work, at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.